The whole idea of having female teachers in school, it's against the Bible. Fire them all. And you're not allowed, don't ever listen to a woman. That's what it's saying. No woman should have authority over men. So you know what else that means? All female doctors, all female surgeons. Sorry, you're fired. It's in the Bible.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, welcome back to another episode of All Rise. This is a podcast where we look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective. We try to employ legal principles to see if, in fact, objections or claims, either against or for the Christian faith, are worthy of our deliberations and our attention. And you, of course, are the jury. This is part 2 of a 2-part series we are doing on an objection against the Bible based on the idea that it devalues women and is inherently sexist. Now, what you heard in the beginning was a clip from Kyle Kalinske, who hosts a YouTube channel called Secular Talk. It's got over 990,000 subscribers as I'm looking at it right now on my computer. By the time we actually get done with this video, or the time you actually see this thing, he might have 1 million for all I know. That's a lot of subscribers. And the video that we're playing a clip from you for is about 10 minutes long. You'll get the full clip link so you can watch the whole thing in the show notes. And as of last viewing, it has 852,000 views. And it was first broadcast on July 4th. It's interesting, 2014. So it's a little on the older side. But I think it still is the kind of thing that we should pay attention to, because this is the kind of objection people make. So without further ado, I'm going to replay the clip, going to react to it a little bit. But this episode is more about a positive case for the way the Bible views women. But of course, as we do at every episode, we want to play the objection of the skeptic. So here's Kyle Kalinske on Secular Talk talking about the ridiculous verses of the Bible you've never heard. And our question is going to be, are they as ridiculous as he might think? And is he mischaracterizing what the impact actually is? So here's Kyle.
And these are things that I didn't know. These are other absurd Bible verses that were totally foreign to me. I had no idea they existed until I read this. And they are delicious. So let me read you some of these, and please feel free to use them when you're debating a bunch of idiots, okay? Quote, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. That's in Timothy 2:11. And the takeaway from this, of course, is the whole idea of having female teachers in school, it's against the Bible. Fire them all. And you're not allowed, don't ever listen to a woman. That's what it's saying. No woman should have authority over men. So you know what else that means? All female doctors, all female surgeons. Sorry, you're fired. It's in the Bible. Never have a female teacher, never have a female doctor.
All right. Well, that is the objection. And as you have probably already, I hope you've already seen or listened to in part 1, the objection actually should be overruled. It doesn't hold water. By the way, as I was listening to this, it just occurred to me, one more thing to say is that he applies it, generally speaking, because he doesn't permit, because allegedly Paul in Timothy, it's 1 Timothy, but in Timothy doesn't permit women to have authority over men. It's very specific in the church. It's not necessarily in the broader context. So his application to teachers in public schools, or even in private schools, or women surgeons or doctors, or let's go to politicians, let's go to other things too. It just simply is a uncharitable, and I would even say misleading interpretation of what that text says. Even in its most harsh interpretation, it doesn't say that at all. That's another thing I just thought of as I was sitting here reacting the second time that I didn't say in the first episode. Well, we're not going to do this. We're not going to respond in detail to this statement or other statements like this, because we already did that in a previous episode. By the time this will have aired, hopefully, friends, you will have deliberated with us on the live deliberations podcast and YouTube show that we'll have typically after each episode, which of course leads me to the break. Our break is this. Deliberations is an important part of the All Rise community. as an important part of the All Rise experience. What deliberations is a time for you, the jury, after watching an All Rise episode, to deliberate with me and my colleague Derek Caldwell live. So you'll see it live on YouTube. You can watch the videos. You'll see it on our social media channels, Instagram and Facebook as well, where we'll interact with you live on questions that arise from the episode before. Now, it can be broader than that. If you have questions on the Christian faith that have to do with topics outside of the particular episode, we're not going to penalize you for that. We are going to prioritize those questions that have to do with the previous episodes of All Rise, but feel free to have some liberty to ask whatever you'd like. But you do that by subscribing to our YouTube channel. And when you subscribe to our YouTube channel, be sure to click the bell so that you get notified when we go live. Because, look, we're trying to do this every Tuesday a week after All Rise airs. So if All Rise airs on a Monday, you're watching this maybe as it airs on a Monday, you'll have 1 week to deliberate and then talk about that with us a week later on the Tuesday, 8 days after All Rise airs, and we'll do that live. But like I said, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel and you click the bell, you'll be notified when we go live, because times will vary. We're trying to do it in the middle of the day on Tuesday, but the reality is I travel a lot, and sometimes I'm not here in the studio, or my time zones are such, or my travel schedule is such that doing it right at the time we always do it is not always possible. But the problem is solved, friends, if you subscribe and click the bell, because it will notify you when we're going live. Also, if you follow us on our Facebook channel or Instagram, you'll be notified that we're going live as well right when we go live, so you can interact with us. So you can send in questions about this episode or any previous episodes in the comment section of these YouTube videos. If you're watching it, that's great. If you're listening to it on podcasts, you can also go to our social media channels and you can leave comments there that might become questions we address in deliberations. And if neither of those work for you, then you can always feel free to send us by email your questions. Go to mail, M-A-I-L, @embracethetruth.org. Send us your question, and maybe we'll be able to address it on the air. But by the way, in the live conversation, you can send in questions live right then and there. You don't have to send them ahead of time. You can send them right in the middle of the deliberations. Maybe something we say during the course of the deliberations episode spurs a question for you. So please, we'd love to interact with you. Embrace the Truth is all about as much interaction as is humanly possible, or even digitally possible. So tune in for deliberations as well, but subscribe. So let's get back to this particular episode's focus, which is the positive case to show that the Bible actually extols the value of women as equals to men. Now, I mentioned this a little bit in the previous episode because it did bear some mentioning as well, is that the Bible actually in the Old Testament, and some people think that the Old Testament is far more harsh and restrictive than the New Testament when it comes to women because of patriarchy and all these kind of things. But the Old Testament actually gives women a lot of authority in explicit and also implicit ways. The most explicit sort of example that jumps to mind right away, of course, is the example of Deborah. Deborah is a woman who in Judges chapter 4-5 is appointed as a judge by God to judge the people of Israel in terms of their affairs, legal and other affairs as well. Now, this is important, friends, because Deborah is not appointed by men in a very limited capacity. No, she is among the judges of Israel. And the reason this is important is because there was no king at the time. The Israelites did not yet have a king. King Saul was not yet appointed as king. And David was not yet king over Israel. None of that. Deborah, a woman, was assigned this authoritative position as a judge in Judges chapter 4-5. So I urge for you to read that. That is not a low position of authority. That is a high position of authority, especially at the time. And of course, there's a woman named Huldah, who is a prophetess and the one who reads the book of the law when Josiah the king had found it after it had been lost. And she was the one who read it out loud. So she's not silent in the church. She's not silent in the congregation of Israel. No, she is a prophetess who speaks on behalf of God and then reads the book of God, the law of God, when the king Josiah had found it. Then, of course, you have other examples of women who feature prominently all throughout the scriptures, time and time again. In fact, I would venture to say this. This might be an overstatement to say that if you turn any page of the Bible, you'll see a woman character And I actually don't like the word character when we talk about people in the Bible, because they're not like characters in some fictional story. They are figures of history. At the risk of some overstatement, what you'll find is many pages of scripture. It's even kind of hard to find a page or at least a chapter of the Bible that doesn't have this. A figure, a historical figure, who figures prominently as the positive and influential figure in the story, who is a woman. Miriam is Moses' sister. She expresses great faithfulness and support for her brother, who is going to be the deliverer of the people of Israel through God from their bondage to Egypt. You have Moses' wife, Zipporah, who has strong moral sense and even corrects Moses in one particular time. Then you have Rahab, who is a non-Jewish woman who actually saves the people, or at least saves some of the people, by engaging in something that's really important so that the spies of Israel can actually make it in the foreign land. So you see all kinds of places where women figure prominently. And these are just a couple of snippets of the stories as well, where women figure prominently, so prominently, in fact, that they sometimes make it into the genealogies of Jesus himself, or in the great hall of faith, as it were, in Hebrews 11, where women are named specifically because of their tremendous leadership and their tremendous faithfulness. So the Bible does not leave them out, as was done, by the way, in comparable ancient Near Eastern documents, either in the Old Testament times or even in the less ancient, but still ancient, New Testament times, where you didn't find a whole lot of women who were figuring prominently and who were in the writings that were telling the heroic stories of people in the Greco-Roman world. But you do find it in the Bible. You do find women making their way into these wonderful lists of people who were influential and powerful and honored people, and they were women. But let's take a couple of looks at some stories of women. The book of Ruth is a good example. I want to pause for a moment just to comment on that fact that there are whole books of the Bible that bear the names of women. And this was, of course, even before Jesus' time, before Advent, before the incarnation of God in Christ. You have women whose names are the markers for important books of the Bible, like the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. Now, Ruth is a remarkable book, by the way, because the real central figure of the book of Ruth is a woman named Ruth who is a Moabite. She's not even a Jew. And because of her incredible faithfulness to her mother-in-law, because of her incredible faithfulness and her character, she is redeemed. She is redeemed, and she becomes the great-grandmother of none other than King David, probably the most revered king in all of Israel's history. And she becomes an ancestor eventually of Jesus, who is the Messiah, the deliverer and the savior of the world. So here you have a Moabite, non-Jewish woman who factors so strongly and heavily in the salvation story of the Bible that she makes her way into the genealogy of Jesus's birth. So the Bible, as far as Christians are concerned, figures around one central figure, and that's the person of Jesus. But all these people, men and women alike, who are in the orbit of this main gravitational character who is Jesus, they're mentioned, and they're mentioned in positive ways, and Ruth is one of them. But I want to pause for a moment as well and think about the book of Esther. You know, the book of Esther is really fascinating for a number of reasons. One, it was the most obvious one, is that it's the only book of the Bible that never mentions God, even once. Yet it makes its way into the Bible. So you think that if it doesn't mention God at all, there'd be a reason to discard this book. One, because it doesn't mention God. And two, because the main figure of the story, there's two. There's Mordecai, who's a man, and of course his family member, Esther, who is Hadassah, but she takes on the Persian name Esther. She is also the main figure. Now, what's interesting about this is the whole story. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I do go into detail, by the way, in my book, More Than a White Man's Religion, where I talk about this and other details about the way women are extolled as equals to men throughout the Bible. And I speak about Esther specifically. Esther, the woman, after whom the book is named, is given an opportunity to potentially risk her life for the salvation of the Jews. The context was the Jews were in exile, and they were essentially under the rule of the king of Persia. Now, the king of Persia took to himself a wife who was Esther, while she was in exile under the Persian rule. And one of the advisors to the king of Persia hates Jews. He absolutely hates Jews. And he devises a plan so that the Jews will be exterminated from within the kingdom of Persia. And his name is Haman. Mordecai and Esther form a plan where they need to be able to save the Jews from the evil Haman and actually turn the plan against Haman in one of the most beautiful instances of irony in all of literature, and it's found in the Bible. But in order to execute the plan, Esther has to approach the king. Now, that might sound like nothing, but actually it's quite something, because in those days, at that time, the law in Persia was that no one could approach the king of Persia unless they were first summoned by the king. And Esther has to walk into the king's chambers unsummoned. She has to risk her life. Now, what happens is, if you walk in to the chamber unsummoned, the king has to raise his scepter to you. And if he raises his scepter to you, you are welcomed. But if he is offended by your audacity to enter into his presence without first being called, and he keeps that scepter at his side, it's a death sentence. So Esther now has to face the possibility of her own death. And she walks into that chamber with all the courage she can muster to risk her own life for the sake of her people. Now, I want you to pause for a moment there and think about this. Who does that sound like? Giving up your life for the salvation of everyone. Who does that sound like? That sounds like Jesus. Esther is given the privilege in that particular moment, not only to be the savior of her people at that particular time of the Jews then, but she saves those people so that through their line, the Messiah who saves the rest of the world would come. So she figures very heavily in the whole unfolding of God's plan. But she also does it in a way that foreshadows the Messiah who would come, who wouldn't come to just wipe out all the authorities on the earth, but would come to give his life as a ransom for many. Esther was willing to sacrifice her life for the salvation on this earth of her people. And that is a type and a shadow of the Messiah who is to come, who would give his life as a salvation, spiritually speaking, for the entire world. And that honor is bestowed on a woman. That's remarkable. That's the Old Testament. And there's many more stories as well. Again, my book goes into a lot of these things. But let's go to the New Testament and see what are some ways we can see the New Testament actually extols the value of women as equals to men. A couple of things ring true for me here when I read the Gospels. Let's take a look at the life of Jesus first. Then we'll move on to Paul and the church that was born after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension to heaven. But let's look at Jesus before all that. We see a couple of things happening that are pretty amazing. And in fact, in some senses, they're scandalous. One atheist told a former colleague of mine that as he looked at the life of Jesus, he wasn't a believer and he didn't become one as far as I can tell. He looked at the life of Jesus and he said, of all the figures of history who have started their own religions, Jesus is unique because he's not a product of his time. What did he mean by that? What he meant is that all of these other religious figures, all of their laws weren't all that groundbreaking because they had within them moral standards that were still trapped by and shaped by and even limited to the cultural mores of the time. So if the mores were sexist, they had laws that were sexist. There was no scandalous liberation of any kind for women or other areas that were cultural issues. But Jesus, this atheist pointed out, was different. He bucked the trends. He did scandalous things, biblically consistent things, but scandalous things in terms of the culture. Let me give you an example of one. Luke chapter 15, verses 8 to 10. Jesus gives a parable, and he was fond of preaching in parables because that's what ancient Near Easterners did. That's what Middle Easterners did. And that's what they do today, by the way, is they teach in parables. And by the way, we do this today as well. We call them movies. But back then, they had through oral stories because they didn't have movies back then. So Luke chapter 15, verses 8 to 10. Listen to this parable Jesus gives about the heart of God in looking to try to seek and find those souls who have walked away from him. This is what he says. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so, Jesus says, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. In other words, in that parable, every sinner, that's you and me, we're the coins. But the woman who's looking for the coin is God. This is important. It's not saying God's a woman or God's a man. That isn't the point. What Jesus is doing is he's using a woman as the proxy for God in a parable to teach men and women about the heart of God for those who are lost. That was scandalous. You simply didn't do it. And Jesus did it. And he did it on purpose to show that women had equal dignity to men. Then we look at another story, and this is one of my favorites because it's found in Luke chapter 10, and it's the story of Jesus engaging with two women called Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha were sisters, and they were sisters, by the way, to a man named Lazarus. And Lazarus, of course, is the one who Jesus raises from the dead in a remarkable story, and Mary and Martha actually figure prominently in that story as well. But in Luke chapter 10, what's happening is Jesus and his boys, the disciples, they're coming for dinner. And Mary and Martha, like good Middle Eastern people, want to be able to provide a hospitable atmosphere for them. And if you've ever encountered Middle Eastern people in any way, shape, or form, you'll know that hospitality is the cardinal virtue of Middle Eastern culture. In fact, if they only have one egg, they will secretly tell you they have two, and they'll send their son or their daughter to the market to make sure they buy enough eggs so that they will present to you more than they actually have. They'll go into debt if it's required, in order to be hospitable. That's how important hospitality is to Middle Eastern people. And it was certainly that important back in Jesus' day. So Martha, in the story, is engaged in the process of hospitality. Mary, her sister, is not so engaged in that. She's actually sitting at Jesus' feet while Martha's doing all the work to prepare for the dinner. And she's sitting at Jesus' feet learning from him. Now, sitting at someone's feet was not considered in any way, shape, or form a subordinate role in terms of ontology. In other words, you were not less than the person who you were sitting at the feet of because you were sitting at their feet. No, it was considered an honor for any male to sit at the feet of another male who was a qualified rabbi. Women were denied that. They were not allowed to sit at the feet of rabbis and learn the law, learn how to read or write, or learn the law, or be taught in any meaningful way by rabbis. They had to go to synagogue and just sit there and be quiet. But they couldn't learn under a rabbi. It was considered an honor reserved only for men. And there's Mary taking for herself what was only allowed to be given to men. Now, Martha's ticked off by this. She's ticked off because Mary is not helping and Martha's doing all the work. But Martha also has been acculturated. You see, she's lived in an incredibly sexist environment. And in the book, I go into a lot of detail about the surrounding environment, religious and political, that was extremely sexist towards women. So she's sitting there and she's been acculturated to something. A woman's place is either at a spindle to make clothes or in the kitchen to make food. And that's where women should be. And here's Mary, her sister, leaving her place to sit where only a man should sit, at the feet of a rabbi, the rabbi of all rabbis in Martha's eyes. And so she's upset and she says, Jesus, don't you care that my sister has left for me to do all the work? Tell her to come help me. Notice something. Martha doesn't actually say to Jesus, hey, Jesus, I could use a little help. Care to roll up your sleeves and come and help me in the kitchen? She doesn't even consider the possibility because it's not a man's place to do that. It's a woman's place to do that. And her place is in the kitchen. And then she says, Mary has taken something that she's not entitled to. Don't you notice it, Jesus? Put her in her place. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you are worried about many things, but only one thing is needful. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. Why is that significant? Because yes, the part of the story that's important, and we all talk about it in churches, is this is a story about how we should stop and smell the Messiah once in a while. Don't be so busy with the things of life that you don't pay attention to what Jesus is saying or what God is saying to you. Meditate, take some time. Don't just be busy. That's good, and that's a good part of the story, and it's a moral of the story. It's a lesson we all should learn. But what's going on underneath all that is that Mary has taken the advantage of the moment where she knows the heart of Jesus is to provide the education for women, the education they were denied. And Martha is so acculturated to being denied this education that she's offended when another woman steps out of her place and takes that opportunity. And Jesus says, what Mary has chosen of her own free will that she normally does not have, but she has it under Jesus. She has chosen an education, and it will not be taken from her, not even by another woman. And that's convicting for you and for me. And it certainly was for Martha. That story is all about women's right to an education. It's a remarkable story. I could go on, and I'll just go on with one other story real quickly, and it's the story of the Samaritan woman that Jesus encounters in John chapter 4. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail here. In the book, I go into great detail about this encounter. But Jesus, a Jew, is talking to a Samaritan woman, and men and women simply did not talk alone at all in those days. And rabbis would never condescend to talk to a woman alone in that context and teach her anything worthy of what he would teach a man. Yet Jesus does it in a strange village where there's ethnic animosity. And what he does by the end of that conversation is he commissions her, essentially, with the truth that he gave her, that he gave to no man before that in the terms he gave it to her, to go and tell her own Samaritan village, which also rejected her for her moral issues, not just for her ethnicity issues, but for her moral issues. He commissions her to go, and she goes to her village, a village that hates Jews and doesn't like her very much. And he makes her the first cross-cultural missionary because that entire village goes and spends 3 days with Jesus. So imagine it, a world in which Samaritans who hate Jews and Jews who hate them right back are told by a woman, come and spend time with this Jewish man because he's the Messiah. They believe her. That's how convincing she was. And they spend time with her, and they come to believe that Jesus, this Jew, is the Savior of the world. Racial reconciliation and spiritual reconciliation happen because Jesus commissions a woman to that authority and that office and that responsibility. And she takes it and she serves beautifully. And then, of course, we come to Paul. In the wake of the life of Jesus, we think of Paul as someone, who in the first episode or the first part of this series, who seems as if women should be silent and have no real authority. Well, we already exploded that myth by looking to the context. But let's look at even more context about what Paul says about women in Romans chapter 16. In Romans 16, Paul lists several people who he considers to be significant in the church's development in its earliest stages and in the gospel's propagation. He specifically names women, calling them deacons, that's a leadership position, co-workers, hard workers, and friends. He began by commending Phoebe in verses 1 to 2 of chapter 16, whom Paul entrusted to deliver the book of Romans to the Christians there. Pause for a moment there. Paul entrusted a woman to deliver what will become one of the most influential books in the history of the world, his letter to the Romans, to be read to Christians. He gave that responsibility to a woman, and he names her. That's how faithful she was in fulfilling this solemn obligation and duty. Michael Bird spotlights this. He spotlights the fact that Paul entrusted a woman to deliver what would become the most influential theological treatise in all of history. And Paul also mentions Priscilla and Aquila, a married couple who he calls his co-laborers or his co-workers. And this is what he writes about them. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to Priscilla and Aquila. Romans chapter 16, verses 3 to 4. Now, Priscilla and Aquila both taught the gospel message to Apollos, who would become one of the most influential and charismatic evangelists and church leaders of that time. But what's important here is this. Paul lists Priscilla and Aquila. Normally, in Greco-Roman times, what you would have is only Aquila, the man, being mentioned. And if you did mention the woman, if you ever condescended to mention the woman at all, you'd say Aquila and Priscilla, because the man would have priority over the woman, and it would be considered almost shameful to list the woman first because the man has the authority. But Paul doesn't do it. Paul lists Priscilla first, and then Aquila, because Priscilla had more of a prominent role in the propagation of the gospel and in laboring with Paul in the beginning stages of the early church. And Paul gives her her due. Now, these are important bridges, I would say, between the Old Testament and the New Testament that you see women figure so prominently. Richard Bauckham points out, Richard Bauckham, by the way, who out of St. Andrews University in Scotland, who is a world-renowned scholar on the Bible and history, he points out that Ruth, a Moabite, that is, of course, a non-Jew, a Gentile, is viewed as a sort of, quote, revitalizing or corrective force to the lawlessness, end quote, elsewhere in the Old Testament narrative. She stood as an example amid a crucial transition between Israel's depraved treatment of women, described in Judges chapter 19 to 21, and the rekindling of God's favor toward Israel through King David. Where did this man David, who revitalized Israel's devotion to God, come from? The answer is this faithful Gentile woman, Ruth, and David's great-grandmother. Her faithfulness to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and Naomi's God, of course, left an imprint on her family's DNA that would span generations. She was so integral to God's redemptive plan for all humanity that the Gospel of Matthew includes Ruth in Jesus' genealogy. In fact, in a time when the vast majority of genealogies didn't even mention a single woman, the genealogy of Jesus mentions 5. That's remarkable. The whole corpus of the Bible has women figuring prominently in every area of the gospel message. From Genesis to Revelation, you see it over and over again. And that brings me to one other thing that we didn't observe yet, but it's important to recognize. And I've said this before in previous episodes of All Rise, so you can go back in fact, the first few episodes of the entire series, of the entire podcast. I talk about the resurrection of Jesus and the evidence for it. And one of those areas is the fact that women were the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And why that's important is that it establishes credibility. Why? Because a woman's testimony was virtually worthless, especially compared to that of a man in a court of law, which means that the Bible, if it was making up the whole story, is unlikely to make women be the first eyewitnesses to the most important miracle of the gospel, which is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. If you were making that story up, you'd pick a man, not a woman, to be the eyewitness because their testimony is worthless. But they picked a woman. In fact, I would say they didn't pick a woman. The Lord picked women to be the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection because he honored them. Not only did they establish credibility for this account, which is a tremendous blessing, but 2, women were there and they faithfully listened. A woman named Mary, his mother, was there and faithfully took on the role of being the one who would bear the infant Jesus, despite the scorn and derision that would come and the possible risks to her life when she was pregnant outside of wedlock. 2, they were present at the cradle, taking care of him. 3, women were factored heavily in Jesus' ministry. In fact, Jesus took support, financial support from women in the course of his ministry, something that would be considered scandalous by most standards. And finally, they were there at the cross. They never left. Others left, but the women didn't leave. They stayed, and they rose early in the morning to anoint the body that they thought had passed. And they were given the greatest blessing of witnessing that all the things they had hoped were not in vain. And they were the testimony that the disciples came to believe was true. Women figure prominently from cradle to cross to grave to empty tomb in the story of the gospel. That's why Michael Kruger points out something so beautifully. He says Christianity was not mocked in the early centuries for being anti-women. It was mocked for being so pro-women. Christianity was made fun of by the cultural elites in the Greco-Roman world because so many Christians were women. As a result, the elites said, oh, this is a religion for women and children, not a religion for men only. No, women were leaving their own religious systems to flock to the church because the church saw in Christ something that elevates women to their rightful status. Michael Kruger said that, and I give a little bit of commentary on it as well. Michael Kruger said that in a presentation called The Church in Her House, the Dynamic Ministry of Women in the Early Church, at the presentation of the Gospel Coalition on June 14th of 2018. We'll put the link to that in the description as well, because that entire presentation is worth your attention. Friends, objection overruled. Sorry, the Bible is not anti-women. Are there some difficult passages we have to deal with? Yeah, of course there are. And is it easy to take potshots? Objections are always easy to lob, but explanations of what's really going on require care and attention. And if you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, give it your care and attention, I think you'll see that the Bible isn't against women. It's in favor of women in profound and meaningful ways. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell in YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, but also click the bell so you're notified when we go live for deliberations. We'd love to see you at deliberations. Follow us on our social media channels as well. You'll be notified when we go live next week, following Tuesday after this airs, so we can interact with you, the jury, on these points. Until then, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense rests.